Now, in a previous episode, I mentioned briefly the first death that the New Zealand Expeditionary Force suffered after they left New Zealand waters, and I thought that would be worth going back to for a full episode, and I've called it The Unique Solemnity of a Drug Overdose, and you will shortly see why. Now, to start off with, let's give you some context. The death of Lance Corporal Gilchrist happened aboard the Ruapehu, HMNZT-5, that's His Majesty's New Zealand transport ship, a troop ship. And I'm starting with some entries from the diary of Captain Tahu Rhodes, who was aboard the Monganui, my grandfather's ship, and he was in fact aide to General Godley, so he operated in much higher circles than my grandfather. Sunday, 25th October. Bit of a roll today. Church at 11 a.m., worked all afternoon. A man died on the Ruapehu this evening from ptomaine. I don't know how to spell it. Poisoning. The casualty list now is 1 man and 11 horses. Later on, he comments the following day, at 3:45 p.m. the whole convoy stopped while the man who died was buried. It was a most impressive sight. Played cards in the evening. Now, I wanted to start with this quote because I was actually wondering how to pronounce this word. And it's actually one of those really interesting things where spelling mistakes throughout history can be really informative for telling us how ancient Romans actually pronounce the words, etc., etc. And I had quite a lot of trouble working out how to pronounce this particular word, so I'm going to go with Tahu Rhodes and pronounce it ptomaine. Now, what is ptomaine poisoning? Well, today we would just call it food poisoning, but the word ptomaine was based on a misunderstanding of what caused food poisoning and casualties, and it's a term that is no longer used by doctors. And in the case of Private Lance Corporal Gilchrist, it looks like it was Highlander condensed milk that had gone off, a brand of condensed milk that was made in New Zealand at the time and is in fact still sold in New Zealand, although Nestle has taken over the brand these days. And here we have an account by Colonel Fred Waite from his book The New Zealanders at Gallipoli. A private of the New Zealand Medical Corps died on Sunday, October the 2nd, and the next day a most impressive burial service was conducted on the Ruapehu. At 3 o'clock she steamed out of her line and took station at the centre of the parallel divisions. At 3:30, when colours were hoisted and lowered to half-mast, the troops in each transport paraded with their bands. The flagship having made the signal to stop engines, the troops on all ships stood to attention, whereupon the Dead March was played, followed by a short funeral service. The body of the first soldier of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force to die overseas was reverently committed to the deep. The firing party, having fired its 3 volleys, the solemn notes of the last post floated over the sunlit waters. The flagship signalled 11 knots, and the convoy proceeded on its way. Now, this photo is not from that particular event, but I was looking around on the internet trying to find photos that sort of more or less matched what we were describing, so I've used a number of those. Then, aboard the Arari, one of the other transport ships, they were keeping a daily ship newspaper for the troops. And fortunately, every issue has been preserved at the Auckland War Memorial Museum website. And so we're able to get quite a lot of details over the voyage from this particular newspaper. And the photo in the background, by the way, actually does show the New Zealand expeditionary ships on their way, actually in the Indian Ocean in this case. The Ruapehu is again providing us with something to think about. A funeral at sea is, at any time, an arresting experience, but when it is participated in, as in this case by the whole fleet, it is invested with an unique solemnity. While Gilchrist was in life, he was a mere insignificant member of the expedition, like any of the rest of us. But dead, he was invested with such majesty that for the space of 15 minutes the pulsing engines of the fleet ceased their throbbing while the men on each ship stood at attention. It may be that some poor mother will learn by wireless today that her boy has been buried at sea. Now, Cates, who I've used his diary before, is kind enough to actually give us a pencil drawing of the distribution of the New Zealand fleet with their escorts. So you can see all of the ships here, and the Ruapehu would normally be in the middle. So based on these descriptions, the Ruapehu moved into the middle of the column, while the ships on either side stayed where they were. And meanwhile, they had 4 military escorts. In the front, there was HMS Minotaur, a British heavy cruiser. On the starboard side, there was the Ibuki, a Japanese Imperial Navy heavy cruiser. On the port side, there was the Psyche, a New Zealand cruiser that was very light, very antiquated, and was due, in fact, to be scrapped a few months later. Now, Cates, on his diagram, says it was HMS Pioneer that was behind him, but that is a mistake. It was actually HMS Psyche, another outdated light cruiser that was posted in the New Zealand waters and also due to be scrapped fairly soon. And we're lucky enough to have the logbook of HMS Minotaur, and she says, "Convoy stopped engines for burial of Corporal Gilchrist, New Zealand contingent." And I've cited some New Zealand stories before because, as I said, eventually letters would get back to New Zealand and then they would get published because everybody in New Zealand was hungry for any news of what was happening with their boys who had headed to war. During the day, Gilchrist performed his usual duties as dispenser, although not in the best of health. About 8 o'clock, he suddenly collapsed, and despite strenuous work which the doctor performed to restore respiration, he expired about 10 o'clock. On board, all had a good word for the little doctor, as deceased was called by the troops. When the fact was his death was made known, a gloominess pervaded the whole ship. Round the hatchways, the troops spoke with hushed voices, and almost everyone remembered some little kindness he had received from deceased during the short time he had been with the force. By the death of Lance Corporal Gilchrist, the ship lost a valuable officer and the men a friend, who was always willing to help them whenever possible. Not quite sure why he calls him an officer, maybe because he was working in the ship's dispensary, dispensing medicines, that he was working as a ship's officer in his role, because a lance corporal is far from being an officer. The body, wrapped in a Union Jack, was carried to the burial place while the band played Abide With Me. Chaplain Captain Ross read the burial service while the body was committed to the deep. The last 3 volleys fired and the last post sounded. The ceremony, as performed at sea, is most impressive, and those who are present do not wish to see another. And then a second newspaper story. The doctors on board carefully attended the patient, but their skill was of no avail, and at 9 p.m. the lad passed away, death being due to ptomaine poisoning. The ceremony was fixed for 9:30 p.m. on Monday, and at that time the blank pulled out of the line. Now this is a case of military censorship. I haven't accidentally left something out there. The newspaper story itself puts a blank there, which is rather ridiculous because everybody knew that Gilchrist had been on the Ruapehu. This was no great secret. But anyway, the Ruapehu pulled out of the line and took up a place in the center of the blank transports. When the whole fleet, warships and transports, stopped in mid-ocean with flags half-masted. The service, a most impressive one, was conducted by Chaplain Captain Ross, and blue jackets formed the pallbearers, the members of the 8th Southland Company being the firing party. The band of the Otago Infantry Battalion played Lead Kindly Light during the service, and at the end of which the last post was sounded, and simultaneously every boat in the fleet dipped its flag as a mark of respect. Now you may notice there's quite a lot of discrepancy between these different accounts. The exact time that things happened, which musical tunes were played, etc., etc. I can't account for that other than general confusion and the fact that there was a funeral service matching the one aboard the Ruapehu, aboard all of the transport ships, and perhaps the bands on some of the ships played one song while the bands on other ships played different songs for the funeral. And then this one was written not by somebody who was aboard the Ruapehu, but who was aboard one of the other transport ships, the Waimana. About 4 o'clock, The burial service for Corporal Gilchrist commenced on our boat. Our service was supposed to coincide with the one on the Ruapehu. The burial at sea service was read to us, and the band played the Dead March from Saul. We saw Ruapehu's flag go up from half-mast to the top of the staff, and then our band struck up The Girl I Left Behind Me, and we dismissed. The Ruapehu had taken up a position between the two lines of troopships, and as the body was put over her starboard side, we did not see the actual final ceremony. At the time of burial, the whole fleet stopped, and the photo above does in fact show some of the New Zealand transports, but it was a photo taken in Wellington Harbour before the fleet departed New Zealand. And then we have a diary entry from one of the officers aboard the transport, the Arawa. George Bollinger wrote, "Calmest day we have yet experienced. Burial at 4 p.m. Both lines of transports and escorts hove together and engine ceased. Ruapehu was in centre. We stood to attention for 15 minutes, and the absolute stillness during that time was a proof of our discipline. Circumstances and stillness made the affair horrible." And poor old George Bollinger was one of these troops who did not survive World War I. And he actually had a bit of a rough time of it because his father was an immigrant from Germany, and he was accused of all sorts of German sympathies. And, well, the army was having none of it, but it must have caused him a lot of stress to be accused of disloyalty to New Zealand. Now, all of the stuff we've read up until now is misleading. And in fact, most of the books and websites that I find that talk about the death of Gilchrist get it wrong because they haven't looked at what the doctor wrote in his military file. This is what he wrote. Gilchrist had not reported sick and was found dead at 8:25 p.m. on the 25th of October 1914. On investigation, it was found that he had been consuming large quantities of condensed milk, the first of which he left opened and exposed for infection for over 24 hours in the small and hot dispensary. It was also found that he was suffering the previous night from headache, diarrhea, and vomiting. Empty tubes equivalent to 87.5 grams of morphia were found in his pockets. Death, in my opinion, was due to an overdose of morphia taken to relieve the symptoms of ptomaine poisoning. So he didn't die of food poisoning at all. He died of a morphine drug overdose. And some of the previous accounts mentioned him working in a dispensary. He was part of the New Zealand Medical Corps, and his job in civilian life was chemist. Americans would call this a pharmacist, a chemist, a drug dispenser. So he had access to the drugs and evidently, I would guess, was probably, well, overindulging in his own product. Now, to do a bit of further research on this, I actually visited the UK National Archives, which are right beside Kew Gardens in London. And I was able to access the logbooks of many of the New Zealand and Australian transports. And here you have a photo I've taken of the front cover of the logbook of the Ruapehu. And inside it, you find this loose sheet. And this is what it says. At 8 p.m., Corporal Gilchrist was taken suddenly ill and the military doctor attended him. He died suddenly at 8:15 p.m. The entry was omitted from official log through being in doubt if the entry was necessary by Gilchrist being a soldier and under military jurisdiction, and also attended by the army doctor. Because one of the things that these ships' logbooks are always supposed to note is if there are any births, deaths, or marriages that occurred during the voyage. And then you can see they've gone back and they've added it in the correct place in the logbook. And in particular, note what it says there. Overdose of morphia, self-administered for ptomaine poisoning. In other words, the ship had no doubt whatsoever that it was in fact a death caused by a drug overdose that was self-administered. And the signature says, if you can read the handwriting, I hereby certify that from inquiries made, I have no reason to doubt that the entire the entries contained in this official logbook recording the deaths of this other guy and J. Gilchrist are correct and true, and I am satisfied that for the inquiry in these cases, no further inquiry in these cases is, sorry, any inquiry in these cases is not necessary. Thanks to the logbook, which gives us precise longitude and latitude, we can even pinpoint where the burial at sea happened, there to the south of Australia. And this story of somebody taking too much morphine strongly reminded me of something that Cates noted in his diary from Egypt in 1915. This is what Cates wrote. While in this place, I was one night talking to one of the Australian Infantry Guard. In the course of the conversation, he surprised me by saying he was a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. I asked him why he was a private, and the following was the result. Several years ago, he took to morphine, and gradually increasing the dose, it got so bad that just before war broke out, it cost him on average 8 shillings a day for drugs. He showed me his arm and legs, and there was not a place where one could put the tip of the fingers without touching an injection mark. As he was getting only 6 shillings a day, or actually drawing 3 shillings, he had to reduce his drugs. He eventually knocked them off altogether, but had to take on whiskey. This, he said, was easy to leave off after the other, and he had every confidence of being a new man inside of the year. It got me wondering about just how legal was it to use morphine at this point in time. And so I went back and had a look at New Zealand drug laws. Now, back in 1866, they'd added opium on a list of poisons, but that didn't mean it was actually illegal to buy or sell it. It was just in the nature of a controlled substance. In 1901, they passed something called the Opium Prohibition Act, but this was mostly aimed at Chinese opium addicts, and it really, again, did not make morphine illegal. Now, in 1912, as part of a bigger international movement against drugs, there was something called the International Opium Convention, and there was an international agreement to put restrictions on trade in opiates, but the implementation of this agreement was delayed by the outbreak of World War I. It wasn't really till 1927, with the Dangerous Drugs Act, that it really started to get to the point of making these things illegal. In other words, at the time that Lance Corporal Gilchrist took his overdose, morphine was quite legal if controlled, and as a chemist working in a drug dispensary, well, he had easy access to all the morphine he could desire. And I found this PhD thesis online. Military Medicines, Anzac Military Pharmacy, 1914 to 1918, published at the University of Dunedin. And since Lance Corporal Gilchrist was from that region, it's somewhat appropriate. And here's what it had to say in terms of the unintended consequences of the cover-up of what was the true reason why Gilchrist died. While in transit during October 1914, members of the 1st Overseas Contingent of New Zealand soldiers to be sent to fight in the European theatre presented to the medical staff on the troopship Ruapehu for the first round of what the medical officers were calling typhoid inoculation injections. On 25 October, during the 10-day interim period before the second scheduled round of injections, Lance Corporal Jack Gilchrist of the Ambulance Corps, Otago Infantry Battalion, an unregistered pharmacist who was serving as dispenser on the ship, died from ptomaine, food poisoning, and was buried at sea. You'll notice that the author of this PhD also missed the fact that it was actually a drug overdose. Carrying on. Although the injection did not contribute to his untimely death, rumours nevertheless flew round the remainder of the troops on the ship that the typhoid injection was a contributing factor. Most of the 31 officers and 785 men of the Otago Mounted Rifles and Otago Infantry Battalion on board then refused to submit to the second round of injections, asserting that they had not actually agreed to inoculation, but only vaccination as stated on the attestation form that each man had signed on enlistment. In other words, this whole episode led to a widespread amount of refusal to get vaccinated against typhoid. And just to end it all up, Jack Gilchrist, even though he was buried at sea, does at least have a memorial. And it's in the southern parts of the city of Dunedin. And you can see it there, Lance Corporal Gilchrist. And even if he did die of a drug overdose, and even if it was covered up in order to give the military a chance for a great amount of pomp and circumstance, he still died in the service of his country. And so we can say, R.I.P. Jack Gilchrist.